Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Party. Today we're quilting Matrix, one of my favorite quilting designs. It covers your quilt with this wiggly curvy grid, and this is a wonderful design for not just quilting in small areas of your quilt, kind of like the background. It's also great for quilting the entire quilt with all over style quilting. So let's jump on the machine. I want to give you some tips for getting started. So I've already gotten started on Matrix, and I began in the center and stitched my wiggly curving lines in one direction from the center to the outer edge. Then I ended up kind of over here, so I just stitched down to the middle and began stitching curving lines, working from the center to the opposite edge through that way. And here's something cool that you might want to try. You can mark Matrix completely. I have this handy dandy stencil that you can use it to mark Matrix on a 1-inch scale. That's 1 inch between the lines of quilting. And this is a continuous stencil, meaning that you can mark it and then move it and the lines will continue, so you could potentially mark a pretty big quilt with it. I'm going to quilt this with the guides on my walking foot. So I have a guide set up here on a 1-inch scale, and that way I can line up with this previously stitched line here and stitch evenly spaced curving lines 1 inch apart. So I'm going to get started, and I'm just lining up that guide and kind of keeping an eye on that, making sure it stays in line with that curving line of quilting. And then I'm slowly pivoting the block to stay with that curve. Now remember, curves can be a little tricky because they can sometimes start to do kind of a pull on the surface of the quilt. I call that whiskering. And it's sometimes kind of the first stage of pleating. You know, fabric shifting is not a good thing. So every once in a while, stop and lift your foot up. I'm using a knee lifter here to lift the foot up and just kind of smooth out the fabric, so that way you don't start getting any kind of ripples or pleats underneath your walking foot. You start to see fabric kind of bubbling up right in front of the foot. That's something that you want to smooth out with your hands. I call that a snow pile. And just like a snow plow, if you start pushing a pile of snow, it's going to hit something and then, make a big mess. So watch out for that. So there, I've stitched my curving line. I'm going to travel stitch along the edge of my quilting space here. I'm kind of guesstimating 1 inch. And now I'm going to have to switch my guide. I'm going to switch out for my left side guide. This is one of the things that the Bernina walking foot has that I think is absolutely indispensable, and that is a left and right guide for the foot. So I just switch it out, just grab the second guide, tighten the screw, and I'm just using a ruler here to space out. So I've got my needle on this mark, and then I'm spacing the guide on the 1-inch mark right next to it, making sure that's lined up just exactly right. And now I can begin the next line of stitching. And as you can see, that doesn't take very much time. I mean, I maybe spent 20 seconds setting that guide up and shifting it into position. If I didn't want to mess with the guide, or let's say you don't have one, then marking the design is a good option. You could use the edge of your walking foot as a guide. That would bring your scale, the lines of quilting, the distance between the lines of quilting, closer together, but that's an option too. But if you're into this and you really want to do more walking foot quilting, then I believe having a good walking foot that has lots of options for you is a really good move. And that's one of the reasons why I use this older Bernina machine. I love it because it comes with awesome feet. A wide variety of awesome feet are built for these older Berninas, and the newer ones too, obviously. But I just really think that that's an important feature. And that's something that kind of guided my hand when I decided to buy this machine. I actually have 3 of these. And so some in the house and this one out here. So that way I'm working on the same machine no matter where I am in the house. I know that's a little obsessive, but that's the system that worked for me. So here I'm switching my guide again. You can see just how speedy this is. It really doesn't take very much time. If you were on a real quilt, and let's say that quilt was fairly large, it might be a better idea to break thread with each line of quilting so that you would stitch across, keep the guide to one side. So let's say keep the guide on the right, stitch the line of quilting and break thread, and then return and not have to shift your guide. You know, so let's say you only have a guide for one side of your foot and it doesn't switch out. That sometimes happens. Some manufacturers only make, you know, a right-hand side guide. And the way that you would get around that and continue to quilt a design like this would be you would break thread with each line of quilting. So you'd stitch down just like I'm stitching now. When you reach the edge of your quilting space, you'd break thread. And I'll just demonstrate that. I'm going to get all the way down to the bottom. And I'll stitch off into the batting area and then return. I won't switch my guides this time. Notice my pace and how I hold my hands on the quilt. This is important because I could take my hands off. The machine is going to feed the quilt through the machine. You know, the feed dogs on the walking foot and the feed dogs on the machine. My hands are really there to steer and to gently keep things moving in the right direction. Now I wanted to demonstrate breaking thread, so I'm going to stitch all the way off into the batting area, and don't worry, that will be secured when I go to stitch these blocks together, and you can find another video on my quilt as you go technique. I will make sure to link that up. And so now I might actually pull up thread just a little bit beyond the edge of my quilting space. And I do that just simply also so I don't have to deal with the thread break. I can just clip those thread tails short because I'm going to secure that stitching whenever I go to bind my blocks together. So here we go. Careful stitching. And notice I didn't have to change my guide. So that, you know, sometimes might work better if you don't have a guide for the opposite side. And it also might work better if you're working on a big quilt and it's really bulky and it's hard to shift around. And I want you to understand that this is completely open to you and there's no right or wrong way of doing it. Now I made a mistake here. I stitched a little bit too close and now my guide is off by a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch on this side. And you know what? I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to keep on stitching and just go with it. And I slowly eased and kind of shifted my hands until the lines were properly spaced apart. So now the guide is right on top of that line. So I could have stopped and made a big deal about it and ripped out some stitches. You know, the lines got a little closer together. I'm not going to though, because that would be a waste of time. And as you can see, that spot, that doesn't look bad. So I'm going to leave it. So if your lines come a little closer together, you're using a guide, maybe you get distracted like I just did, then don't worry about it. You know, I mean, even if I was putting this in a show quilt and I wanted it to be just absolutely spot on, absolutely perfect, I probably would not have ripped that unless I thought it was, you know, a deal breaker, you know, something that would be glaringly obvious on the surface of the quilt. But large scale quilting like this on a 1-inch scale or bigger, your eye's not going to catch a slight difference in the distance between your stitching lines. It's really not that big of a deal. Now let's talk a little bit about stitch length. This is a question that I get a lot, and it's really important to understand. I took my hands off the quilt there for a second just to show you that my hands really aren't doing the job here. I mean, I'm steering and making sure, like, I can just use my fingertips, just kind of poke it in the right shape. But really, my hands are just steering the quilt. The actual feeding, the actual process of making the stitches, that is being regulated by the stitch length setting on the machine. And so I have the stitch length setting because I'm using Minky fabric. I'm using Minky on the back here. That likes to grip. So I am using Minky, and that means that my stitch length has to be a little bit bigger. So this is a 2.5 millimeter stitch. I'll tell you, visually, this is the same looking stitch that I produce with regular fabric on the back when I have my stitch length setting to 1.5 millimeters. So don't get confused. Like, normally, if I had a regular 100% cotton fabric on the back, then I would be using a stitch length of 1.5 millimeters. And the Minky is what changes things because it is so fluffy and it really likes to hold firmly on the back of the quilt. And that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind, you know, like if you're putting that on a big quilt, you need to go on ahead and understand that putting Minky on, let's say, a queen size quilt, that thing is going to be not only extremely heavy, it is also going to be like a rock on your machine. It is going to set and stay in place and not really want to move. So doing something like suspension is going to be a really good idea, simply because that will lift the quilt up and it will ensure that it's not going to drag against you and really pull against you in a bad way. So as you can see, this is just a simple process. It's actually quite relaxing. Just stitching these curving lines, basing one off of another, using that guide. Now, one thing that can happen with grid designs is as you hit the lines, you can sometimes experience pleats. And please check my book. I shared a lot of information about dealing with pleats, about why they happen and what you can look out for. And you can find that in the book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish Matrix. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about quilting matrix with me today, and you're ready to jump on your machine and give this design a try. Now, if you'd like to stitch out a nice big square and connect them together to create the marvelous mosaic quilt behind me, you can find the quilt pattern to follow along with my new book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. So in this book, you'll find lots of tips and tricks for getting started walking foot quilting, as well as 7 beautiful quilt projects to follow along as well. So I hope that you'll come and check out the book at leahday.com/walkingfoot. If you like this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt.